Great to have you over here, Professor McCloskey. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you because you're one of the most recognizable names in the field of economics, of philosophy, the humanities in general in the world.
Thank you.
So to have, and you've written around 23 books, if I'm not
25 by now.
20.
Stop me before I write another book.
Well, it's hard to keep track if you write so much books. I've read a few of them. I haven't read all of them, of
You
course.
haven't read all of them? Well, what kind of a scholar are you? Yes, I understand, dear.
Well, I'm just starting out, so
Yes.
well, I think that I want to talk a lot about your books and your ideas, the ones that I've read at least. But before we do that, I think it was Derrida who said that to understand a person, you need to understand a person's ideas, you need to understand the person's biography. You cannot separate the person's idea from their biography. And you in particular have a very interesting background. So why don't we start there?
Yes, I do. I changed gender in late 1995 is the most interesting thing I've done. My aged mother, who died a few months ago, used to say, "Dear," she said to me, "don't do anything more interesting," which I think is excellent advice. No, I was born in 1942, so I'm very old. I was raised in Boston, and my father, in fact, was a professor at Harvard, a professor of political science. And I went to Harvard for both college and graduate school. And I started when I was 16 or something as a socialist. Not a very scholarly socialist, I have to admit, but anyway, I sort of felt I was a socialist. And then in college, I became a Keynesian because at Harvard College, that's what was on offer. And then graduate school, you might call me a economic engineer. We all thought we were going to go down to Washington and fine tune the economy. In fact, I wrote my undergraduate thesis on road and rail in India. Now, why I would be able to advise the Indians about whether they should use trains or trucks, I don't know. But that was the attitude at the time, that we in the West could very easily advise you in the global South, or however you want to call it. And it was a crazy idea, but I gradually got over it. For a long time, I was at the famous University of Chicago in economics. Milton Friedman was a colleague of mine. And so that's ordinarily interpreted as being on the right. But I'm not a conservative. I'm what you could call a 19th century liberal.
Classical liberal.
Sort of in the style of John Stuart Mill or something like that, or Adam Smith. I'm a Christian, so I always cross myself when I mention Adam Smith. And then in the 1980s, I got very interested in the humanities, starting with Greek rhetoric as a narrative of how people argue, how they persuade each other. And then I did some books on economic method using a rhetorical approach. And then in the 90s, I changed gender, I said, but I also started to drift towards seeing that words matter in the economy, not just among economists, that's fairly plain. If science studies since Thomas Kuhn have shown that argument matters, I tried to convince Tom that he did the rhetoric of science. He didn't like the word, but that's what he did. Anyway, so I finally came to this series of books called the Bourgeois Era, a trilogy, great big thick books, where I argue that what matters for economic development and economic growth is changes in people's minds. Not so much roadways and airplanes and so on, but what's going on in their heads. And it's ideology, ideas, and then especially the idea of liberalism. So I finally concluded in all this, and I've written then a number of books about it, that the key to enrichment, as you've seen in India, and it's certainly true in China, is liberalization, allowing people, as the British say, to have a go. They get their turn at bat, to put it in cricketing terms. So that's my life. I have a couple of grown children. I've got 3 grandchildren. I live in a big apartment in Chicago.
And I'm just wondering, because you transitioned in the 90s, things were very different then. The transistor is just coming up now, so I don't know how. Wasn't that inclusive? So I'm wondering if you faced any sort of resentment from the academia in particular.
Well, I would be the last person to know if, I don't know, an appointment at some place were blocked because, that McCloskey, she's a queer, or he's a queer, they would say. And I maybe that happened. I somehow don't think it, because economists on the whole, even if they're Keynesians or rather socialist in their leanings, they do believe much more than other people do in laissez-faire, in allowing people to do what the consumer sovereignty. So they say, oh, well, if Donald wants to do that, oh, I don't care, is mostly their attitude. Interestingly, I got more, what can I say, criticism from historians and people on in the humanities, especially historians, because they think of people as in some class or caste, as you'd say in India, and they're stuck there and there's no way to change. And how can that be? So, no, it's been an amazing change. I mean, when I did this in late 1995, it was still quite unusual. I wasn't the first by any means, even I was among the first in academic life, I must say, but I was by no means the first to have changed gender in anywhere. But by now it's become so boring. You say, well, I was once a man, and they say, oh yeah, that's interesting. Say, how about those Red Sox? Or how about the Pakistani cricket team or something? They don't care.
Because it has become so normalized, and that's a good thing.
It's very strange. I mean, it's quite shocking. And it shows, by the way, speaking sociologically, that these ideologies, these ideas I've been talking about for quite a while, can change very quickly. There's an assumption that a lot of economists make, a convenient assumption, that ideas, sociology, culture, you might call it, although that's kind of a vague term, is a background that never changes. Like this photograph I have on the back of me, which, by the way, is the Grand Canyon of the Colorado in Arizona. But that's not really true. Things change very quickly. I mean, in India, for a long time after independence, the only successful politicians there could be had to be Brahmins.
Yeah.
But it's
far
not
as
true anymore. It's not true anymore.
yeah,
Once an obsession of mine. Once Indian cricket was a preserve of the upper class, right? Then television came, and you see boys playing cricket everywhere in India. And indeed, the most important change in the Indian situation is after 1991, India moved to various kinds of, not complete, liberalization, but sufficient to make a really big difference in growth rates. That's the
yeah.
tragedy of some other countries I know and love, India and South Africa, Brazil and South Africa, which haven't adopted this liberalization that's in China after 1978 and India after 1991, which has been so successful.
But you've also talked about liberalization and liberal ideas, and I think that both often don't go hand in hand, because you can have economic liberalization, but society
Yeah, that's right.
will still be
That's right.
regressive.
That's
But-
right. China is a great example. It's not. I believe that freedom, that liberty is liberty. Gender liberty, liberty for dress and opinion, and the economy, and allowing you to start businesses when you want, and having a vote, and being able to choose your leaders, and all that, I believe, is just one thing called liberty. But in many cases, spectacular small cases is Singapore, but the large case is China. And people think there's a Chinese model, and they think that the success China has had in the economy is a result of the political tyranny, but it's not. It's a result of releasing part of the tyranny, the economic part. I mean, there are still, as I understand it, tariffs between states in India.
Yes.
That if you drive a truck from Uttar Pradesh over the border, you get hit with have to pay money, and that's crazy. But so it shows that India hasn't completely liberalized, but fortunately, you're a democracy. I don't know, crazy, I admit, but we Americans have no bragging rights anymore.
Well, you elected Donald Trump.
Yeah, we elected Donald Trump. Now, how crazy can you get? I mean, Modi looks completely sane compared with Donald Trump. So,
well, I'm thinking, because you mentioned China, I've heard many Marxists. I've heard Richard Wolff make the argument that China's success has to do with the fact that China is communist. Like, what do you make of that?
well, it's silly. I mean, come on. These aren't communists. At least they weren't. Now, unfortunately, Xi Jinping wants to be the new Mao. And among the things he's doing is introducing labor laws that happened earlier, that slow down the mobility of the labor force. But then what he's also doing, even worse, is using the state enterprises like the railways to buy up private companies, to purchase private companies, to bring them back into the state. And you can see why he's doing it. He'll get power, but it's a very, very bad idea from the economic point of view. But the reason the Communist Party of China was able to succeed is that it stopped being communist. It stopped what my hero, when I was a child, a teenager, Lenin said, "We will make the whole economy into one big factory," with, of course, Lenin in charge. And that was his plan, and that was the plan under Mao. And then in 1978, they said, whoops, no, that didn't work out so well. We're still bumping along at $2 or $3 a day. Now income per head in China is on the order of $45 a day in present day prices, about three or four times what it is in India now. But India itself has enormously improved since those. Anyway, no, it's not communism. It's not, in other words, it's not the centralization that, of course, is the core of socialism and communism. I mean, if it means anything, it means that the central plan will make the decisions. In the 1950s and 60s and 70s in India, that's what you did. You had 5-year plans. Now they were largely imaginary. They were largely figments and crazy absurdities, but anyway, that's what they were. Because people like Nehru and the Gandhis believed in socialism.
A sort of Gandhian form of, I think that in the immediate aftermath of independence, almost every party, regardless of whether they were on the right or the left, they sort of adhered to the socialist model.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, that was true in the world. It wasn't just in India, as you know. I mean, Keynesianism. I told you about what we in the 1960s we graduate.
Didn't Samuelson also believe in 5-year plans?
Absolutely. He was, in fact, I have a friend named David Levy at George Mason University, who noticed, and then he made a paper out of it, that in every edition of Paul Samuson's textbook, there was a chart about how fast the Soviet Union was going to catch up with the United States. And the chart never changed, but the dates changed. So in 1948, I guess that was the first edition, it's, in 10 years, the Soviet Union is going to catch up with the United States. In the last edition, which was just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1987 or something, the same chart, except now it's 10 years from 1987. And then, of course, when communism fell, we discovered in East Germany versus West, the USSR versus the USA, that they were not catching up. Whereas Paul, I call him Paul, although I didn't know him personally, but my mother was Paul Samuelson's longtime mixed doubles tennis partner. So she knew him, so I'll call him Paul, as though I knew him. But he believed in planning the way that the Keynesian does. If you're John Maynard Keynes, you're very smart, and you're going to run the economy, and everything will be fine. And it's not a very sensible idea. The idea that someone in Delhi or Washington or Brussels knows what you want to buy this afternoon. When you start thinking that way, you think, what? How could that possibly be so?
Well, speaking of Samuelson, it reminds me of your book, The Rhetoric of Economics, which I absolutely loved, because the assumption is often that economics is supposed to be this disinterested scientific field, Economists are just scientists looking at the data and doing models and stuff. But you said, no, this is about persuasion, this is about rhetoric. It's about spectacle. It's about appeal to authority. And
That's
that,
right.
I think, absolutely blew my mind. First, because I agree with that, to a certain extent. And second, because I never expected a libertarian to make this argument. So
Yeah,
because I've heard Marxists say the same thing. I've heard Yanis Varoufakis makes similar sort of argument. So it was shocking to hear a libertarian make this kind of argument.
that's
But
right. That's right. Well,
I do want to talk about that part of the conversation later. But first, I want to understand why you think economists, even when they actually use rhetoric, still are sort of reluctant to admit that they use rhetoric. They claim to be this summer
well,
sun in times of being bit
well.
postmodern.
So much of their self-image, as you said, is about being scientists with a capital S. But even physical and biological scientists have ideologies and authority figures, and they argue too. I was sort of tutored, as it were, in my understanding of this was sharpened because when I got into science studies, they're called the children of Thomas Kuhn, Paul Feyerabend, and lots of others. You discover that Galileo was an arguer, and some of his premises were somewhat dubious. It's not as if he got it right and he had it all right. I mean, it's been shown that Newton in Principia Mathematica cheated. I'm forgetting the exact thing, but it's on the matter of the speed of sound, which is not that hard a thing to get right. He screwed it up and then he lied about it. Pasteur in France kept double laboratory books. He had one set of laboratory books that he showed to the French Academy, and another where he kept the actual findings, which sometimes weren't the way he wanted them to go. Now, I'm not saying that all scientists are cheats or something, but I am saying that scientists are human. If you had to summarize science studies since the 1950s in one phrase, it would be scientists are human beings. And if they are, they're open to argument. Look, American geologists, especially geologists in the United States, refuse to believe in plate tectonics, refuse to believe that continents move. As you know, the Indian subcontinent was a particularly spectacular example of this, because in geological terms, it very quickly was zooming up the Indian Ocean and smashed into the Asian continent and rose the Himalayas. That I took geology in college. We do this in the United States. I had to have a science course, so I took geology. And this was in 1962, 63. The American geologists had no account of mountains, which you can see is a rather serious problem if you're a geologist. They had no theory of how mountains were formed. And you can only have such a theory if you believe that continents move. And that went on for 50 years. And you can make various quasi-sociological arguments. For example, the guy who first proposed that the continents moved back in around 1912 was a German meteorologist. He was not even a geologist. And so they could say, oh, well, he's German, and then the First World War happened, and oh, well, those Germans, are there. And most American geologists lived on a big plate that didn't move very much or hadn't recently. only the California people were on a fault in any way. They're crazy out in California. I mean, there's rhetoric in sociology, even in mathematics. So it's completely unsurprising that economists are humans too. But they hate to, as you said, they hate to admit it. Say, no, I'm a scientist. I'm a scientist with a capital S. Look at my white coat.
Searching for absolute truth.
Yes, I have gotten more and more radical about this because I finally decided that to do economics correctly, you've got to admit ethical considerations into it in a serious way. Here's a book I just published, although it's going to be hard to see because of this thing.
It's
Oh, here.
like Side Bettering
Basic.
Humanics.
Humanomics. Yeah. Bettering Humanomics, a new and old way of doing economic science. And it says to do economic science correctly, you need to admit that it's a social science. You need to admit that the economy is run by humans, hence humanomics. You need to admit the evidence of literature. You've got to read the Mahabharata and learn about ethics there. Here, I'm gonna turn off this. Whoa, no help. I didn't mean to do that. I'm gonna turn off my background. Can I do that? Because then you'll be able to see.
Yep.
Close virtual background. Okay. Am I okay now? No, it's still there. Damn it. There we go.
Yeah.
Oh, here it is. Here's the book.
Mm-hmm.
See, it's very short. So I urge you to buy it.
So, that reminds me the human element about the importance of experts, because this is something that I've been thinking about, which is that who sets the standard for a field? Because let me give you one example. So, for instance, in the 1980s, when AIDS came up, it was first called gay-related immunodeficiency disorder, because it was assumed that only homosexuals had it. And so what scientists were doing is they were only studying homosexuals and leaving out everyone else. And in one of the experiments, what they did is they were giving pills to some people and placebos to others. And when those who were being experimented found out, they started selling the pills because AIDS was a sort of death sentence. So they thought, we're dying, so you cannot, we're not lab rats. You cannot just experiment on us. So what these experts were doing in this place is by being detached, they were actually harming the cause, which led to a rise of secondary experts. Activists and everything who studied the literature, who studied the biology and the medical literature, started writing peer-reviewed papers and putting forth their concerns. And that is how, we got to where we are, because we have a better understanding of the disease now, and because of those secondary experts. They had a very, crucial role to play. So do you think that only primary experts should be the one to set the standards of the field?
I completely agree with you. I think that's the great advantage of what India has and what the United States has, which is a free press and democracy. Anthony Fauci, the doctor at the head of the contagious disease office of the American government, was deeply involved in this AIDS crisis at the beginning. And Fauci, following these these extremely unethical experiment on actual human beings procedures, said, well, we'll try out this drug and this one, and on this people, that person, and that on the other person. And the AIDS activists said, no, try everything. Try cocktails. That's where the notion of AIDS cocktails came. If you think that drug A, B, and C might individually have an effect, put them all into everyone and see what happens. And that it solved it eventually. We still don't have, as you know, a vaccine for AIDS, and I wish we did, but we don't. And in fact, in places like South Africa, my sister, who's also an academic, she's an expert on this. In South Africa, most of the transmission of AIDS has nothing to do with being gay. It's heterosexual. Truck drivers wandering from one prostitute to another. In any case, yes, the science was improved because of democracy. It's as simple as that. We just saw what happens in a totalitarian country when the science is trimmed to fit the politics. I mean, partly we saw it with Donald Trump, but a worse case was the origin of the disease in China, where the Chinese didn't tell anyone that it was happening until it was basically too late. And then as you know, the one doctor that started to shout about it, they put him in jail. So it is terribly important that we recognize that scientists are humans, and that doesn't mean they don't have expertise. Of course they do, but it's one argument among many. You know, we're going through this now in the United States, maybe in India too, but in the United States there are lots of crazy people who have opinions about the vaccine. Well, you know, that's the cost of democracy. Large numbers of people in conservative parts of the United States won't take the vaccine. So it's a matter of human argument. And John Stuart Mill was correct that on the whole, a free press and a free discussion make for better science.
Yep, I completely agree with that. In fact, my last show was about vaccine deniability. People who were spreading fears about vaccines. So, but just as an aside to the last point, that there was also, because I remember this just now, there was also this scientist who claimed that that AIDS was being caused because of the gay lifestyle. And he got very famous, and that's the same thing. But this also ties into the topic about expertise and science being also a part of the spectacle. So, but I also wondered after reading your book whether the framework in which all economics, whether it's Marxist or libertarian, whether they have this sort of same framework, because it seems to me that what they agree on is that science is, they basically approach things to a sort of rationalist, utilitarian perspective, and they think statistics matter and facts matter, and that they're trying to be disinterested. Like that is at least a goal, to be sort of disinterested. So on the framework, I think there is a broad agreement among whether they're Marxist or libertarian or all sorts of economics. And I'm wondering what you make of it. Do you agree with that? And B, what do you think we should do about that?
Well, I think that facts matter. I'm writing a book
Mhm.
now. I told you I keep writing books, which goes back to some work I did a long time ago on English medieval agriculture. And it matters whether you have an argument about strips of land, scattering of strips of land. It matters quantitatively. So you have to get the facts. So the facts matter. But the facts don't speak for themselves. And as you're suggesting, there's a framework that is like, I don't know, it's like an iron cage around people's heads, so they can't think freely. They do passionately believe that they are objective scientists, and that ideology doesn't play an opinion, doesn't play a role in their scientific conclusions. But both Marxists and bourgeois economists also have a substantive theory of humanity. They both believe that people are driven by interests, material interests, profit alone. And I have slowly, gradually come to understand that that's not true. That people, I mean, I'm an economist, so I'm a bourgeois economist, so I believe in, and was once a Marxist. But so I believe that interest is important and matters. But it's simply not the case that it covers everything. Look, vaccine denialism is against the interests of the people who believe it. There's now a rate in southwestern Missouri, the state of Missouri, there's a raging COVID epidemic. The hospitals are filling up. It's like it was back in New York once. And it's because they deny it. It's not in their interest. They voted for Donald Trump. That wasn't in their interest either. So both Marxists and bourgeois economists have this problem that they don't acknowledge that people are moved by words. They're moved by ideas. They're moved by ideologies. They're moved by identity. And identity, in turn, is, or words for that matter, are not a result of what we call economics a max-u model, maximizing utility. You come up to a mother who's holding her infant child in her arms next to a cliff, and you say to her, "I'll give you $10 if you throw your child over the cliff." She says, "What are you talking about? Of course I won't." And then the utilitarian economist, whether left or right, says, well, we're just arguing about the price. I'll give you $100,000 if you throw the child over the cliff. She won't do it. I'll give you $10 million. Go away. So it's not, people go over the top at the Somme. They riot in the streets of Cuba, or they protest in the streets of Havana, and what's the place? Anyway, they're Minsk, against their own. It's against their own self-interest.
Right. Well, just to play the devil's advocate,
Sure.
do you think that, because I think what you're essentially arguing for is the inclusion of rhetoric into economics, so the formal
that's right.
inclusion of it. And let's call that rhetoricism. Do you not think that this is also a form of reductionism, like scientism
Sure.
or logicism? So,
Sure.
this is also So you agree with that?
Sure, you're absolutely. It would be a terrible mistake to take interest out of politics, economics, sociology, however you want to talk about it.
But what I'm saying is that if the soundness, because rhetoricism assumes that the soundness and validity of the argument has a lot to do with the literary style or the persuasiveness of it. So let's say the objection to that will be that, okay, we agree that there is rhetoric in economics,
Yes.
but that is not what we should aspire to. When there is rhetoric, it's bad, and we should cut it out. We should aspire for some uninformed.
Well, I just think, and I understand you're not saying you believe it, but I just think that's naive. Not having a rhetoric is a rhetoric. You say, look at my tests of significance, statistical significance. How can you argue with me? It's a way of shutting people up. And it, as a matter of fact, it turns out to be scientifically incorrect. But even so, people use it all the time. So there's no such thing as not having a rhetoric. Even if it's the rhetoric of not having a rhetoric, you're stuck with the fact, and it's simply a fact, and it's historically documented and makes a lot of sense, that science and scholarship and marriage and friendship are about persuasion and argument, and it's that to use the word rhetoric that way is to misunderstand how fundamental it is. Say, oh well, the rhetoric is just a matter of ornament, and well, we'll strip away the ornament, and that will reveal the true argument. But that kind of move is not conclusive and it's not non-rhetorical.
Do you think that?
And by the way, it's often a power move, because I say you have to put things in mathematical terms of the following sort, or else I'm not going to pay any attention to you. When economists say, where's your model? That's what they mean. They mean, where is your Paul Samuelson maximizing utility under constraints? Show it to me.
So you're saying it's an argument from authority?
From what?
Argument from authority?
Yeah, it's an argument from authority. And the authority of Paul Samuelson and his brother-in-law, Kenneth Arrow, were immense. They were both very nice people, as it happens, but they were, and it's not their fault that their very powerful and interesting arguments were taken as holy writ by so many people. In fact, both, I did know Kenneth Arrow a little bit. And as I say, I have a family connection with Paul Samuelson. And they were both open-minded people, open-minded scholars who had read a lot. Both of them were educated men, whereas their intellectual children, and especially their intellectual grandchildren, are extremely narrow and won't read anything outside of the Journal of Economic Theory. So I must say, it's very hard to speak to such people.
But you are an exception to that, because I have read some of your articles, even in like Rethinking Marxism, and I was surprised to find a libertarian economist over there. So
Well, I
I
had
mean,
some friends. I love the rethinking Marxism crowd. Jack Amarillo and that group. No, I think they're great because we had in common. I'm talking about some colleagues, allies of mine in this rhetorical movement. Let's see, I'm forgetting his name briefly. The great Don Lavoie at George Mason was a colleague of mine on this. And Don and I would go to conferences with these Marxists and have a great time because they knew all of us, the Marxists and Don and I, were postmodern. We thought of ourselves as postmodern. I'm a proud graduate of the 1988 Summer School of Criticism and Theory, held in Hanover, New Hampshire, which is a kind of summer school for, and mostly for graduate students in English and French and so forth. And anyway, we were postmodernists together. Now they were Marxists and we were bourgeois, or actually Austrians would be more like it. But, we got along fine. So I've got about, I don't know how many articles in Rethinking Marxism. I've got something like 3. I did one, which I liked very much, an article, a reply to Gayatri Spivak on imperialism.
The postmodern Gayatri, the one who translated Derrida. Yeah.
Yeah, she did.
So
That's right.
what I'm thinking is, do you think that scientific theories are considered true because they're rhetorically efficient, or are they considered true because they are empirically true?
Well, both. I mean, empiricism is a rhetorical claim. It's a rhetorical move. I say, look, all the victims we can see of AIDS are gay. Therefore, the data shows that it's the gay lifestyle, this silly phrase, that causes AIDS. Well, the facts are there. Early in the AIDS epidemic, that's what it looked like. And, I have friends who went through it. It was just terrible. People dying around them constantly. I have friends who died. So numbers are not, let me express it this way. You know that words are not self-interpreting. The Indian Constitution doesn't come with what would have to be an infinitely long set of footnotes explaining what everything means. It's, as my friend and Dean Stanley Fish says, every text is understandable or not within an interpretive community, right? Well, the same is true of numbers. You ask me, what kind of a day is it in Chicago now? Is it a good day or a bad day? And I say 6. You say, well, 6 what? I reply to you, don't you believe in numbers? It's 6. You say, come on, Deirdre, tell me what you mean on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 1,000. What do you mean by 6? Oh, you're obviously not a scientific thinker. You don't believe in numbers. I mean, that's obviously a completely crazy way of talking. Any human statement, whether it's verbal or mathematical, quantitative, is in a context. And it's such an obvious point that I wonder that people don't understand it.
Right. Well, it's nice that you mentioned Stanley Fisk, because I have been thinking, because I have read a lot of heterodox economists,
Uh-huh.
Marxists, and you, I would say, are one of them. So I have been very attracted towards the heterodox economics and the postmodern crowd.
Yeah,
And I have, what I'm seeing before 2 years, say 2 years from now, I think I was absolutely convinced that postmodernism is this sort of leftist conspiracy, thanks to
yeah,
the likes of Jordan Peterson. So that is the conservative argument that often goes on, postmodernism is
sure.
out to destroy Western civilization and things like
It's just
that.
terrible. Yeah,
But when I did read postmodernists and libertarians, I was surprised to find how much they said in common, because especially for instance, the psychiatric community, it
yeah,
was Thomas Sass who was
that's right.
critical of the psychiatric community, and then I read Foucault in Madness and Civilization, who had the exact same critique of the
Sure did.
psychiatric community. So they were basically saying that, look, power is not just government. It's like,
Yeah,
okay, fine, government has power, and it controls people, and it's a surveillance state
yeah,
and
yeah,
things like that. But it's also in other institutions that you ignore, like science or the arts. They also have a sort of power hierarchical structure which oppress and which seek to control human beings. And psychiatry
sure.
was, I think, is the best example of that, because
Although it
of
was, although understand, it got its power from the government. If
in
if
what.
if if psychiatrists weren't running state institutions for the insane, they would not have this power. If there were not license laws for setting up as a psychiatrist, they would not have this power. And both those come from the government. I mean, famously, Freud made a deal with a Swiss guy who ran a hospital for the mentally disturbed. He made a deal that, let's see, how did it go? It was this terrible compromise, because Freud had always said, my patients have to be voluntary. They have to buy into this process of psychoanalysis. And then he made this terrible compromise because he wanted more data. So he agreed. He said to the guy, here's my theory. You apply it to these compulsory patients, and I'll get more information. And you will get, I suppose the hope was, you will solve the problems these people have. No, I don't quite agree that there are lots and lots of private powers wandering around. The real power is coercion, being able to put people in jail. I mean, the absurdity in Northern Europe of the 100-year reign of terror against gay men that finally started to dissolve in the 1970s, about 100 years. Before that and after that, nobody cared much about homosexuality. But in that period, when psychiatry was growing up, the psychiatrists bought into this notion that being queer was a disease,
mental disorder,
a mental disorder. And it's the state, it's the cops that made it possible. It's very interestingly, in Southern Europe, this didn't happen. There were no laws against homosexuality, except under Franco in Spain, for example, or in Italy, even under Mussolini, there weren't laws. And in France, nowhere in the codes is homosexuality mentioned. But in Germany, Holland, Scandinavian countries, England, and their offshoots, and I'm not sure what the situation was in India. Was homosexuality illegal in India? Were you jailed for being homosexual?
We had the British gave us the colonial laws, IPC section
That's right.
267.
Exactly.
And until 2018, homosexuality was considered to be a criminal offense.
2018?
Yep.
You mean 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
Good
we had
Lord.
Section 377, which criminalized homosexual acts.
Oh, well, as I said,
we inherited that from the British.
Yeah, of course you did. And so did Australia, the United States, Canada. South Africa, I imagine, is the same way. Any of the Commonwealths. In the horrible case is Uganda right now.
So I'm thinking what you make of a sort of argument for a libertarian version of postmodernism, a libertarian postmodernism. Like, would you describe yourself as such? And do you think that you can form a coherent argument for that?
A coalition, did you say?
A libertarian postmodernism,
Yeah.
as a school of thought.
Well, it's like the old joke about the Christian doctrine of infant baptism, where you baptize a baby into the Christian faith. You can ask someone says, "Do you believe in infant baptism?" Believe in it? I've seen it. I've been to ceremonies where babies have been baptized, and it's the same. Do you believe in liberal? I prefer to call it postmodernism. Well, here's an example. And see, I regard postmodernism, as its name implies, as being against various modernisms. A long time ago, I wrote a paper on this. Can't remember whether it ever got published, but it was I think it was an economist's guide to postmodernism. I think it was published somewhere. And it said, look, Plato was a modernist. Plato believed in rigid forms to be imposed on people. Aristotle was not so much, but Plato was. And dogmatic Christians or dogmatic Hindus, they're modernists. Postmodernism is a liberation from the top down, the Brahmins to tell us what to do. And I think that fits very well with liberalism. In fact, I'm somewhat puzzled why so many of my left-wing friends think that postmodern goes with socialism. Now, when you talk to them about it, they'll say, well, I don't mean communism. I don't mean Stalinism. And then I say, well, when 55% of the economy, as in France, goes through the government, and the government regulates much of the rest, you've got at least 55% socialism, and the temptation of authority and top-downism is very strong.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the reason leftists believe in postmodernism is because I think that they do not adhere to a sort of, it has to do, I think, with social justice rather than socialism per se.
Yeah.
So I think social justice aligns well with postmodernism. Socialism.
So they think. I think it aligns better with laissez-faire liberalism, because what's made us rich, as I argue in this trilogy in the 2000s to 2010s is what made us rich is liberty, not schemes from the government.
Not capitalism, not capital.
What? Not what?
I mean, you make the argument that ideas, not capital,
Yeah, that's right. Certainly not capital. I mean, there are spectacular examples of this, of spending in foreign aid in India and lots of other places, which had no effect at all. The spectacular case is Ghana, a case discussed by Bill Easterly, the economist who worked for the World Bank on these matters. And they were going to make an artificial lake to generate power, electric power from the dam to refine refine the ore that's made into aluminum. And the result of this enormous expenditure by the World Bank was nothing. In fact, it was worse than nothing, because with this lake, there were lots of mosquitoes, and the result was that disease in the neighborhood of the lake rose, and there wasn't enough electric power to make any aluminum, and it was a complete disaster. So industrial planning, socialism, protectionism, all the schemes of all the subsidies to this industry and that, all the schemes of central planning schemes of government usually don't work. Occasionally they work, but so what? I mean, occasionally if you shoot a shotgun, occasionally you'll hit something.
Mm-hmm. So I recently read a review of yours of Polanyi's book, The Great Enrichment, the Great Transformation, the Great Transformation. So yeah. I think you argued there that what happened, the Industrial Revolution was not a sort of single Western novelty event. In fact, it was continuity. Capitalism is a sort of continuity. Markets of demand and supply have always existed since Keynes. Yeah. I think that was your argument. But I think that in the Great Enrichment, but you describe capitalism in the book on liberalism as a sort of great enrichment, as this, significant event. And I think that Polanyi's point is not that this was a Western novelty per se, but I think his major point was that this was a momentous event, which I think that you also share.
Well, I don't think so. I think that's one way of talking about his book, The Great Transformation. But what he meant, if you look at it closely, the book closely, what he meant is that there was a transformation originally from planning to free markets, and that was terrible. And now we're going back to planning, and that's a good thing. He was not a party line communist. His wife was. She helped found both the Hungarian and the Austrian communist parties. But he believed that, like a household, an economy should be run from the top. And he really had no conception about the magnitude of the Great Transformation. What I call the great, not great, we keep getting confused about the Great Enrichment. He didn't see it as enrichment. Whereas, and it's partly not his fault, because he wrote this famous book in the early 1940s. By the way, he was financed by the Ford Foundation, which I've always found, or maybe it was Rockefeller, but anyway, a foundation based on a great fortune, great so-called capitalist fortune. But we hadn't worked out the numbers very well. We didn't know the magnitude of modern economic growth very clearly then. But by now, what is it, 80 years on, we really should stop forgetting that the increase in national income from what your ancestors and mine had is a factor of 20, 30, 40 higher. It's an enormous increase. And it's confined basically to the last couple of centuries. And my claim is that it's a result of something Polanyi did put his finger on, namely this move towards laissez-faire. Look, in that review with which my co-author was Santi Hejibu. She's of Indian origin, her parents came from India. We argued that Polanyi was correct as in saying that the economy is embedded, as the sociologists say. That the economy is not something outside society, it's within society. And I completely agree with that. That's what I say in humanomics, right? But he got everything else wrong. He got the economic history wrong. He got everything wrong. He got the politics wrong. He and his wife thought that socialism would be emancipatory. Well, to tally it up, look at the fully socialist regimes and see how they worked out.
But what do you think about the argument that the speedy, sudden transition sort of disrupted traditional way of life? In India, I think the case would be that of imperialism, of, capitalism coming in, and the handloom weavers, they were sort of deprived because of goods from Britain and factories and things like that.
Yeah.
So what do you make of that argument that capitalism deprives people of their traditional way of being and of their livelihood, in fact?
Sure.
So another example would be that of Soviet Russia, which was
Sure.
That's the speedy transition part. The shock therapy was clearly not the success that it was people thought it would be. In fact, it disrupted the Soviet economy.
Well, but as your question points out, essentially, it's progress that's the problem here. It's not market innovism or socialism that's the problem. Those are simply the sort of the stages on which progress can take place. Progress is going to move people, for example, out of agriculture and into the cities. It's done it every time. In the United States in 1900, as late as 1900, still 1/3 of the population was on farms. Now it's something like 3% or 2%. And the same thing is happening in India. Progress is the problem, but it's also the solution. If you're going to get higher income in India, which you are and have been since 1991, there's going to be disruption. It's the same in music. It's the same in painting. It's the same in poetry, in science. Tagore writes superior poems and drives out the bad poets, if there are any, in Bengal, right? Newton gets it right, and Descartes gets it wrong. And so Newtonianism, it took quite a while, crowds out Cartesianism in French physics. I mean, it keeps good. You know, you may not like change, at least. Let's just call it change in art. I'm not particularly thrilled with modern classical music, European modern classical music, a 12 tone and so forth. I turn it off when it's on the radio, mostly. But
tonal sort of music.
The
Soinbach, that's what you're talking about?
Yeah, the musicians love it. There must be something in it. They think it's great. And okay, that's how things change. And in fact, here's an even more fundamental point. Any action that you take in the society or in the economy affects someone else badly. You invent a new form of marketing. Let's take Amazon, Jeff Bezos. Well, that's driven a lot of brick and mortar firms out of existence. But even if you buy a loaf of bread, you take it away from someone. Now, in actual fact, it's not one person. You suddenly decide you want more bread. And you say, I'm going to buy 2 loaves of bread. To a very slight extent, that raises the price of bread for everyone. And when you add up all those little teeny, very, very small increases in the price of bread spread over the whole society, it turns out it's exactly the price you paid for the 2 loaves of bread. So you can't avoid changing things. If you want to make a law that everyone has to buy your poetry, right? There you go. Because you're a famous poet, and you've always been a famous poet, and there are these new people, and you don't like it, so you get the government to come in and stop them, then poetry doesn't advance. So it's not just about capitalism. A perfectly managed socialist economy would have exactly the same problem. In fact, as you know, it was a sort of a finding of the socialist calculation debate in the 1920s and 30s that an ideal socialist society would operate just like an ideal, let's use the old word capitalist society, except that, of course, the distribution of income would be better. But you'd have prices, and they would be set exactly correctly by the smart people in the planning agency, and everything would be fine. But that requires, if the economy is going to change, if it's going to get better, requires disrupting people. Coal miners don't go on mining coal. So it's got nothing to do with capitalism.
Well, that's a very interesting way of putting it, and I never, I don't think I ever looked at it that way.
Well, I didn't think of it until a few years ago. So don't blame yourself.
Well, I think the music example sort of makes it clear, because You know, we see the transition from classical music to jazz to rock to now hip hop. And I don't like some of the music, but it's like this is just how things are. And you know, you can't change it. This is
and we want them to be, and that's crucial. We want them to be that way. I mean, if you think it's a good idea that the economy be planned, steel output, why don't you want a ministry of rock music? And no one with any sense wants a ministry of music.
Well, that would be terrible for creativity. So,
of course it would. And so, creativity in the economy is killed by protection, planning, et cetera, in the same way that it's killed in art or science.
Well, I have taken too much of your time, but I'll ask just one more question. How do you reconcile social justice with free market? Like, because the assumption is if you care about the poor, you know, you've got to do something about them. You've got to give them universal basic income or minimum wage or things like that, so that, you know, they have a basic level of sustainability, you know. But with free market, what you say is, I care about the poor, so let's not do anything. How do you reconcile that?
Well, judge the results. The poor get better off in free societies, and they don't instantly get better off, but in the long run, they get much better off. That's the first point. Now, I'm a Christian liberal. You can be a Muslim liberal or a Hindu liberal or a Buddhist liberal or whatever, and it's the same point. I believe that I have an obligation to the poor, as Jesus and Buddha said. You've got an obligation to the poor. Okay, what to do? And if I give 10% of my income to my church. I'm an Anglican, and I tithe. We call it tithing because that's the Latin word for tenth. I give 10% of my income to the church, and then they give it to poor people, partly. And they'll do a much better job than I would do with my 10% of my income. But what's best for poor people is to leave the economy alone. That works the best. And I can think of 100 examples of this. The largest migration in human history just happened in China. In the 1990s and or 2000s, 200,000 people moved from the interior of China to the coasts. Now, the government didn't like that particularly, and it made it as hard as it could, but it didn't enforce it too much. In order to get your children educated, you have to have a residence permit to be in Shanghai, for example. And if you're from some Western province, you can't get it. So they put obstacles in it, but 200,000 people moved in response to market signals. And they're much better off. The best poverty program is migration. Starting in the 19th century, very large numbers of Indians moved around the world as indentured employees. They moved to Brazil, they moved to the Caribbean, they moved all over the place. And that made them better off. So I'm in favor of, by the way, just incidentally, I'm in favor of free migration. I think it's outrageous that the government presumes to stop me from trading with someone. I mean, I want them to be here in the United States. Makes them better off. It makes me better off. What's the problem? So I think that there are all kinds of problems with this top-down centralization. One of the big problems, and I make this point a lot, is that it gets corrupted. It turns out that the Tata is made better off by being in bed with the government, right? Because it gets regulations and tariffs and blah, blah, blah that help the stockholders in the Tata Corporation or family. It's the golden rule. Those who have the gold rule. And we have to stop it. We have to prevent. And one very good way, it turns out, to prevent the rich from getting richer by taking control of the government, is what they do all the time, is competition, is a laissez-faire economy.
And how do you see the future of laissez-faire economy given the right wing?
I'm not very,
backlash?
It's not really the right wing that's the problem. It's both wings, both the right and the left.
The populist, the populism.
Yeah, that's right. We liberals are not on the left-right spectrum. Because both the left and the right on the spectrum want big government. They want government to interfere in the bedroom, and they want government to spend a lot on them. Whereas we liberals say, no, that's very dangerous. Make the government small. But the trouble is that people like to be slaves or children. And this is a problem. I'm going to preach, as long as I have breath to do it, that the dignified life for a human is to be an adult. In fact, I'm starting to call liberalism adultism, because all the other political philosophies assume or assert that poor people are either bad or sad. If they're conservatives, they say they're bad, and that's why they're poor. If they're on the left, they say they're sad, and that's why they're poor. And they want the government to come in and fix that. It's much better to let the economy grow. I mean, I can give you hundreds of examples of it. In the 1930s, there was a so-called Dust Bowl in the middle of the United States. Farms failed. Well, these people moved to California. They were the so-called Okies, from the word Oklahoma, and they were very, very poor. True, they didn't walk to California; they went in automobiles, but still they were poor. Then they got to California. They worked in fruit orchards for very low pay, but their children went to school. I have a friend who was a case of this. She became a professor of economics at Berkeley. Her parents came from Iowa, having been tractored out, as they say. The banks foreclosed on their farm. What happened is that after the war, or during the war, and then after the war, they got jobs in the airplane industry, making airplanes. And that was the solution to their problem, getting out of Iowa or Oklahoma or Kansas and moving to California. So liberty is the way forward. I'm somewhat pessimistic because people they want security, not liberty. On the other hand, they want dignity above all. The mother of the Tunisian street vendor, Mohammed Bouazizi after he burned himself to death and started the Arab Spring. She said, "Dignity before bread." And that's right.
I learned a great deal from you. It was fantastic talking with you. It was, in fact, an honor talking with you. Thank you
Well, thank you, dear.
very much for doing this. But I have to ask you, did you enjoy the conversation?
Very much. I think there is. Look, we had an expression in Iowa where I taught for quite a while called a pig in mud. A pig is happiest in mud. And I'm happiest in a serious intellectual conversation such as the sort we've had. So thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
I'm glad that you said it. It really means a lot, especially coming from you, because you're one of my intellectual heroes, heroines.
Buy more books. Tell people to buy the books.
Buy her books. She has written, I have loved reading, and I will read the trilogy. And if you don't have any problem, we will have you over here to discuss that over again.
I'd be glad to.
And
okay, dear.
Check out her website, DeirdreMcCloskey.com, I think.
No, it's not com, it's org.
Oh, Deirdre McCloskey.
But if you just Google my name, you'll get to it.
I'll put the links in the description below. Like, share, and subscribe, and have a nice day.
Okay, dear.